Thank you to the patrons for supporting the channel.
Welcome back, everyone. A couple videos ago, I made a video about nostalgic horror, and it got me looking back on some of my old horror influences. Specifically, it brought back this idea I had about looking back over some old Flash horror games. My patrons ended up voting on that topic, and so here we are. So this video is going to be a little bit shorter than I usually make them. There's a couple reasons for that, but the big one is that I have a big project that I just needed some buffer time and funding to actually get it done. But I don't just need time, I also need the funding for this mystery project, which is why I'm happy to say that
this video is sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends. That's right, baby, we're a real YouTube channel now. Feels like a rite of passage. If you liked medieval fantasy back in the day like I did, Raid Shadow Legends has everything you could want in the genre and more. With content from years of updates, millions of players, incredible champions, enemies, and bosses, Raid is an expansive fantasy game on a massive scale that fits in your pocket. And you can use my QR code or links below to download Raid yourself to your mobile phone or PC. My favorite aspect is just the breadth of amazing champions there are. The ability to choose from literally hundreds of customizable characters is amazing.
Hey, listen up, Skeleton Crew!
Since Raid's launch, Death Knight has gained sort of a cult following. Everyone loves an underdog, and his aspirations for heroics has led Raid to finally give him an upgrade. But is this really Death Knight's chance at heroism? Or is this Ultimate Death Knight really just a new and improved copy of himself? Well, if it was the former, I wouldn't have brought it up, so I'll let you take a guess. Death Knight is once again being outshined.
Ultimate Death Knight? It would have been way cooler if that were me.
Ultimate Death Knight is definitely a champion you'll want to use in battle. Increases squad defense by 30% and completely blocks one hit, decreasing the damage by 0 when one of the allies is attacked. He also has an amazing skill called Rats Off to Ya. This area of effect skill is a tribute to Mr. Nibbles, a pet of the OG Death Knight. Overall, an amazing addition to the team. And here's the thing. Anyone can get the Ultimate Death Knight champion right now. All you have to do is log in and play Raid for 7 days between now and October 27th. And to make it even better, you can use code DKRises to get tons of free items. Level up your new champion to level 50 and 5-star Ascension. And to make it even better, Raid just released a new feature, Awakening, and a new fortress, the Iron Twins Fortress. The Iron Twins are tough, but if you manage to beat them, there's a big payoff waiting for you. The ability to awaken your champions, which allows you to choose a blessing which can completely change the way you use them on the battlefield. There's never been a better time to get started. New players use my link or the QR code right here and get a free starter pack worth almost $30, a free champion Vergis, and also this in-game loot. You'll find these rewards here in your inbox for the next 30 days only. Just use the link in the description, and I'll see you in the game. Thanks again, Raid, for sponsoring this video.
Catch you later.
Flash. Before YouTube completely took over the visual medium online, Flash animations were some of the best things you could watch back in the day. Homestar Runner, Ultimate Showdown of Ultimate Destiny, Xiao Xiao, Badger, they're all classics. But aside from just creating many a viral video, Flash also became the basically standard engine to create browser games on. Armor Games, Miniclip, Congregate, Girls Go Games, Cool Math Games. The golden era of web-based games rose with Flash.
And of course, along with classics like Fancy Pants, Portal, Flash version, World's Hardest Game, honestly there's no use naming them all, there's too many. But along with all the classics, the horror genre was quite popular among this ecosystem, especially once sites like YouTube allowed you to record and share people's reactions to these online frights. Flash games were a powerhouse for a long time, but not too long ago, support for the Flash player was dropped by almost every single major browser in an effort to modernize web games online. Flash was increasingly dated and vulnerable, and systems like HTML5 and WebGL had been doing it better for quite some time. And while in the long run, putting Flash to bed made sense, what it meant is that probably millions of games and animations would no longer be playable. Of course, the community did a great job of working on preserving and archiving these games and animations, transitioning them to other formats or creating their own Flash players, but inevitably many of these games were lost. December 30th, 2020 was a real big day for the lost media community. Like Thanos snapping his fingers, thousands of creations and memories wiped off the face of the earth.
But this got me thinking. Some of my earliest horror memories are with browser games, specifically Flash games. And while they were very influential for my development of a love of horror, are they actually still scary? Would they hold up today? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at in this video. Despite many of these games being lost, many more were salvaged by archivers. So we'll have a chance to play quite a few, and then talk about a few that may be lost.
I have some qualifiers here though. Today, I'm going to be talking explicitly about horror games. There are tons of classic morbid or spooky themed games that were made with Flash. Alice is Dead, Don't Escape Hell, the original Binding of Isaac, and maybe I'll go through these sometime too. But today, I want to talk explicitly about horror games. Games that are trying to scare you, not just unsettle you. Also, I'm drawing most of these from memory or personal connections, so if there are any that you remember, tell me about them in the comments. With that said, let's start with...
If there's any of these types of games you remember, it's this one. Everyone and their mother played this game, a classic haunted house experience compressed into a click-around browser game. Because of its widespread popularity, it basically became the gold standard for games like this, but from memory, I don't feel like it's going to hold up quite as well. If I remember correctly, it was pretty much just click on random stuff and then a bunch of cheap jump scares. So let's see if I remembered correctly.
Gameplay-wise, I was pretty correct in my memory. There aren't really any puzzle or gameplay elements aside from click around. Basically, each room has a few interactive objects or areas, and you just sort of click on them repeatedly, and eventually stuff happens. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. Click on the picture, turn on and off the lights, click on a piece of paper, click on the picture again, ooh, a spook happens. After you've clicked on everything enough and it's done with the spooks for that room, there's a big spook and you can move on to the next room. Now, despite my more sarcastic tone, this actually works decently well because it doesn't get boring. The game is like a scare-a-second experience. Nothing ever slows down enough for you to get tired of anything. Spooky sounds, heads falling from the roof. In addition, there aren't mountains of lore or vagueness to the story. It's all pretty straightforward and simple. And despite the cheapness of the spooks, they did get me quite a few times. And if you're not spooked by them, you can at least get a laugh. I think the reason the house works so well is because it's not trying to be something that it isn't. It's not trying to be a deep, atmospheric experience. It's built to gather your friends around on Halloween, turn the lights out, and have some fun getting scared. It doesn't get boring, it's entertaining, and I'm genuinely surprised at how well it does what it does. On top of that, I was really not expecting it to look as good as it did. I mean, it didn't look hyper-realistic or anything, but I really liked the black and white look with the film grain, and the animation is surprisingly polished and sleek looking considering it's a 10-year-old Flash game. All of this combined really gives the vibe that you're watching an old cheesy haunted house movie, which I really like. And the music and sound really further enforce that feeling. That vaguely irritating but memorable piano loop and the incredibly cheesy stock sound effects. The audio and visuals come together to create an atmosphere that I can't say is actually very tense, but very much fits what it's trying to do. So, do I think it holds up? Yeah, actually. Again, I think the reason is because it's not really trying to be something it's not. It didn't have much higher hopes other than to give you a couple spooks, and hey, it did that. And it didn't drag on or get boring or confusing. It was just a fun, short, spooky experience. But then, of course, there's The House 2, the long-awaited sequel to the scariest game ever made. What about it? Well, I don't have a lot to say that's much different, but you know what? That's not a bad thing. This is exactly what you'd want from a sequel to The House. The graphics are even sleeker, animation is better, and there are some vaguely more interactive elements. The end has a vault with a passcode you need to remember from earlier. Sure, they're more superficial, but they feel like they're tying things together, and it pushes it a little bit further. The story is similar, but not exactly the same, but it still ends with a creepy woman with long hair screaming at you, and what else could you want from a The House game? I was genuinely surprised by what my takeaways were from these two games. Going into them, I really thought these were going to age maybe the worst of all, gimmicky jump scare fests, and they still are gimmicky jump scare fests, but they did it well. Let's see if our next game holds up in the same way.
So I'm dropping this one in here now because it's the last one I played, but all the other ones fit together so narratively and then tied each other up so well that it needed to go somewhere. So this is a game that I never remember actually finishing, but it had a pretty big impact on me. It inspired a short horror story that I made that you can read along with 11 other original short horror stories on my Patreon right now.
The game is a classic point-and-click puzzle game. It runs pretty short, but at the very least has more gameplay elements than other point-and-click games at this time that were basically just click on a photo over and over until something happens. The menu tells you everything you need to know. This guy's bad news, these girls are in for a bad time. And hitting play throws you right into the action. You're tied up in a basement. The rest of the game follows essentially essentially the same gameplay format as this little opening. There's something in the way of you getting out of this area of the house. If you make a loud sound, find somewhere to hide. Pretty simple. And while I wouldn't say the game is actually that scary, and I'm not a huge fan of all the jokes in the game, it does a good job at feeling creepy the whole way through and having some shocking moments. On top of that, out of all these games, it actually feels a little more, like a game. The puzzles aren't the most complicated thing in the world, but you do actually feel like you're moving from objective to objective, focusing on helping this girl escape. The game also sets itself apart from a lot of these point-and-click browser games by not using exclusively real-life photos, instead having the characters be this cute cartoon style, which clashes really interestingly with the dingy and drab environment. On top of that, the sound design works pretty well, especially once they set up that making too much noise may alert the killer. Using the slow stairway elevator is incredibly nerve-wracking the first time, in no small part because of the dread-inducing sound it makes. All in all, I don't want to make it seem like the game is more than it is. It's a creepy little puzzle game that feels a little more like Little Nightmares than, say, Outlast. It executes well and is engaging for what it is. So does it hold up? I'd say so. Another little experience to revisit on Halloween with some friends. However, this next game I would say feels a tad bit more like Outlast mixed with the house games.
Exmortis gained quite a reputation. Created by Ben Leffler, his first ever Flash game, the game starts you off with an abrasive credits sequence, a few sentences to get you started on the premise, and then just drops you right in. At the time, it felt like a different breed of web browser-based point-and-click horror game. The story elements, the atmosphere, the scares, the visuals, it just felt more cinematic and unnerving, and it certainly had a longer runtime than most.
The premise is simple. You wake up in the middle of the woods with no memory of where you are or how you got there. Nearby, a desolate and ominous-looking house creaks in the fog, the only piece of shelter you can find. Knowing you won't last long in the cold and exposed to the elements, you tentatively approach the house and find that the door is unlocked. Turning the handle, you enter the rickety dwelling. Like most of these point-and-click browser games, the actual mechanics of the gameplay are simple. Basically, just click on stuff and things happen. Open doors, pick up items, look closer at the environment, and later in the game actually wielding a weapon. This game does actually have a bit more meat on its bones though, with actual puzzle elements relating to symbols you find around the rickety old house, along with finding codes and reading lots of lore. The game looks dirty. From the incredibly low quality JPEGs being used to the overall brown and orange palette to the blood and grime that permeates every surface, the place feels quite a bit more cohesive than a lot of similar games using the real photos technique. Of course, doing original art for environments in games like these make it a bit easier to create a unified aesthetic, so it is quite impressive how well Exmortis combines what are probably just stock photos of completely different places into a setting that actually feels like one place. Plus, I am quite partial to the game's main style, which I can only describe as icky. It really makes you feel like the place is covered in mold, dust, and all manner of unpleasantness. This graphical style, along with the audio, really helps form the atmosphere. Most areas are accompanied by a low drone or muffled wind, every once in a while the repeating sound of a creaking lamp, a dripping faucet, or the ticking of a grandfather clock. A far cry from the spooky music loops of, say, The House. And the surprising lack of jump scare throughout the game, especially in the genre, really play into this. You're waiting for the silence to be broken, a loud sound or a spooky face to appear, and for the most part, that doesn't happen, so the silence feels that much more tense. All of that combines to create one of the better atmospheres out of these games. Whatever it was trying to feel like, it succeeded. Even the low-quality images add to this. Things meld together into tones of brown and red, details fading into the darkness as the wind rattles the windows around you, and you feel the tension rise as you wait for whatever killed all these people to come back. And for those of you who remember, that concept is something specifically terrifying to me, even more specifically in point-and-click games where the controls are so limited. For me, it goes back to one of my first spooky game experiences with Nancy Drew Message in a Haunted Mansion, where you'd have to break into people's hotel rooms and find clues before they got back. Okay, I've sung this game's praises so far, but I want to go a bit more into the specifics, what it does well and what it does not so well. Aside from the atmosphere, which I think is definitely the game's strongest point, I think it has a pretty creative use of the limited gameplay mechanics you can have in a game like this. For instance, near the end of the game, after having no combat mechanics, no enemies or real imminent danger, the game gives you an axe. Suddenly, the game is telling you something is coming. soon. Horror games love doing this, mostly conveniently giving you a pop-up like press shift to run, not so subtly telling you that you're going to need to use that information very soon. And again, tying it into the gameplay, the concept of putting a combat mechanic in something with such little control as a point-and-click game like this really adds tension. No dodge rolling here. Similar to the tank controls in Silent Hill or the shooting mechanics in Resident Evil 4, limiting your controls adds tension to each encounter. And while the player's actual use of this axe is pretty limited in the game, it does give you a bit of an adrenaline rush, if only for a moment before it gives way to laughter. The final thing I'll give this game props for is that it has multiple endings. Technically 3, though really more like 2. Each one has a wildly different implication, but all tie into the wider lore pretty well. The ending I got was pretty fun, spoiler alert, looping me back into the beginning of the game in a way that made me go, okay, that's pretty good. However, this game is far from perfect. While there's a lot to admire about it, I mostly felt bored. While there were some puzzle elements, most of the game hinged on click on something so something else will happen somewhere else. Without a lot of connection, sometimes it's like, oh, this key will obviously go to unlock a door, but other times it's like, oh, read this one book and then the door will open. Unlike with something like The House, where it's a spook-a-minute experience, so clicking stuff over and over with no real connection to progression doesn't get boring, a slower-paced game like this doesn't work quite as well. Lots of trial and error and clicking back and forth between the long transitions, and because there aren't a lot of jump scares, it just sort of is silently clicking around. And because your character doesn't have much of a motivation, it just sort of feels aimless. Like, what is my goal here for the first half of the game? Along with that, while the low quality images can add to the aesthetic, they also make things really hard to tell apart from each other. Is that an item? Can I click on that book? Is there anything to interact with here? And especially when the game's ending is predicated on basically clicking every single thing in the house, it's really frustrating slowly moving from room to room, back and forth, straining to look for what couple compressed pixels I missed clicking on. And it doesn't help that sometimes you just do click on everything, and it just bugs out and doesn't let you move forward. Finally, while I think there's some fun stuff with the ending, the game really wants you to read the lore. And I'm sorry, especially when there's already not a lot of spooks or goofs, the idea of spending like 20 minutes reading is not that appealing. Maybe it works for some people, and I thought maybe they'd use the long space of time while reading to put like a scare when you put the book down, but nope. Just read a bunch of journal entries that would probably cumulatively take about as long as every other thing that happens in the game. So generally, for the genre that it fits in, it definitely stands out as a more creative, cohesive, and overall more ambitious concept. It has a lot of elements I like and clearly had a lot of work put into it, but does it really hold up? Not really. It might be a fun trip down memory lane and might even spook you a bit, but I would definitely keep a guide handy because it can get a bit boring without having some direction. But much like The House, that isn't the end of the Exmortis story. There's actually an Exmortis 2 and 3, and unlike The House, where they're all vaguely the same, the lore Exmortis built out actually did give it some room to expand. So did it do that successfully? For Exmortis 2, definitely. Exmortis 2 is far superior to the original. It has some of the same flaws, but the scale that this game pulls off is actually really surprising. Instead of being given no information and being placed in a small location, this game throws us directly into the deep end. Humanity on its last legs, a horde of unstoppable creatures known as Exmortis have nearly wiped out humankind. They move as a wave, dark clouds and screams encroaching over the land, destroying and killing in the most brutal ways imaginable. You play as one of only a few survivors as the hordes approach. Finding temporary refuge in an abandoned church where you hope to meet other survivors, you are only greeted by a mysterious supernatural figure who sends you on the first steps to possibly reclaiming humanity. It functions almost identical to the original Exmortis. Navigate your way around, pick up some items, and yes, unfortunately still a lot of reading. This time though, I felt the diary entries were at least a bit more engaging. They just went on a bit long. Although the beginning sees you escaping the horde through a town, most of the game takes place in yet again an abandoned house. This time the still warm bodies of a slaughtered family inhabit the place, and instead of the threat being some strange killer in the woods, you know all too well that you have limited time before the demonic hordes of Exmortis are upon you. One big improvement over the last game is the sense of urgency and purpose. You actually feel like you have goals as you move through the game. Okay, I need to open this vent. Okay, I need to find a passcode for this, and later on, well, it really expands the combat mechanics with a shooting gallery section with just the goofiest demons you've ever seen. Near the end, it gets fucking surreal as hell and has these weird abstract puzzles as you work through like a gate to the demon world. Overall, with the limited resources and gameplay elements, I'm genuinely surprised how well the game adapts this larger-than-life story and premise, and it feels right. When it comes to the graphics, it continues this icky vibe from the last game, but I feel interactables were easier to spot, which is good, although those bullets at the end add like a sparkle effect or something, bro. That's just a mess of pixels. So, does Exmortis 2 hold up? Honestly, I think so. While maybe not the scariest game in the world, it has much better writing and is a pretty fun little experience if you're looking for a quick dive into a demonic, disgusting world. Plus, it's got a twist ending that was pretty okay, if a little goofy.
So what about the third Exmortis? Well, like a lot of these Flash games, I clicked play on it, and it was just blank. Unfortunately, a lot of these games just aren't playable anymore, which leads me to talk about what I want to talk about next, which is games that at least appear to be lost for now, at least from what I can see. If you can find a way to play Exmortis 3 or any of these upcoming games, please let me know. I'd love to be able to play them again.
This game was made by Doritos. Make of that what you will. But seriously, it was a pretty unique idea. The game featured full motion video and played through different scary rooms as you tried to escape the hotel. The thing that really made it stand out was all the little fourth wall breaking gimmicks the game had. During particular spooky moments, it would use your webcam to take photos that would show up later in the game. It could only be played between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m., ensuring that you'd be playing it when it was dark outside, although this was easily bypassed by messing with your computer clock. And it ended with getting an actual real phone call that would lead you through how to escape. But it only existed as a promotional stunt for old Dorito flavors coming back from the dead, and it, along with its sequel, Asylum 626, are unplayable as far as I can tell, even from the archives. Unless you were lucky enough to play it back when it came out, it's likely we won't ever be able to play it.
Hey YouTube, what's up? Mr. Geeky here, and today welcome to Stay in the Light.
I've discussed this game before. It's one of my first memories of playing a spooky game. I think it was based on a movie. The gameplay is pretty simple. Stay in the light. By jumping from light source to light source, or using glow sticks in some areas. It scared the hell out of me as a kid, and I remember being able to play it at least a few years ago in an old Halloween video, but since then, I have not been able to find a way to play it.
I guess I more so wanted to use this as a stand-in for basically any of these games you can no longer play. So many people have memories of Flash horror games, hell, Flash games in general, and despite the great archiving work people have done all around the internet, it is inevitable that somewhere along the way, things would be lost. This next one isn't so much lost as I think it may be broken.
This is another pretty viral hit, although it's not really a game. It's a short Korean horror comic. Having read through it, it has a pretty good story, but the writing was not what made it popular.
The reason you had Let's Players doing essentially readings of the comic is because it had jump scares. While scrolling through the building tension of the story, one of the frames would actually animate and play a sound, locking your screen on that frame. It happens twice in the story, and was a genuinely cool way to utilize the new opportunities afforded by having comics be available digitally. Similar to something like Scary Maze Game, which we'll get to, it was also a great way to scare the shit out of your friends. And while it's still a fun little short horror story, it seems that after Flash's support was dropped, the jump scares don't work. They're just individual panels now. Another victim of Flash's demise. But there is another way you can scare the shit out of your friends.
This game is an absolute classic, a viral sensation at the time. It even got its own Maddie B. Raps video. It's such a simple premise and game that I can't justify a long review on it, but it definitely deserves a mention.
It's pretty simple. You use your mouse to maneuver a maze. Secretly though, as you lean in, focusing hard on steadying your hand through the tight corridors, the game is waiting to pull maybe one of the most iconic and cheap jump scares of all time. All in all, the experience lasts maybe 45 seconds, maybe. And once you know the scare is coming, what the twist is, you would think that the house of cards would crumble and that would be the end. But surprisingly, the game almost seems to work better on a meta level, coming back to it after so many years. I found the tension waiting for the jump scare, actually knowing about it beforehand, made the experience way more intense. And when that one screen pops up, the maze that is burned into your memory as the one with the scare, the tension jumps even higher. You haven't played the game in years, you don't know exactly where the scare is, but you know it's coming, and then, bam. The scare itself is actually really anticlimactic. It's interesting how the tables flipped in that way. What was originally meant to be an unassuming flash game with a fake out scare ends up being a tense as hell 45-second experience with a pretty ending. Weirdly, it ends up being one of the games here that holds up better with age, at least for me, in an interesting experiment in how a piece of media can completely change with time and context.
So yeah, I'm actually pretty surprised at how well some of these actually held up. It is pretty sad though, the amount of these games that are either broken or lost to time because of Flash dropping its support. The lost media community revels in being able to bring back lost content like this. So any aspiring lost media detectives, maybe some of these games that I couldn't get to work would be a good starting point for you. Otherwise, let me know about some of the old browser horror games you remember playing in the comments. Check out my Twitch, Sagan channel, Twitter, Patreon, Spotify, yada yada yada. I'll see you all next time.